Racist restaurant owner kicks out black couple only to regret it when he learns their true identity. It was a bright summer evening in London, the streets alive with the energy of people enjoying their night out in the heart of the city. A restaurant named Lux Door stood out, its exterior draped in understated elegance. This wasn't just any restaurant. Lux Door had become the city's go-to destination for the wealthy and the elite politicians, CEOs, and celebrities alike. Filled its dining rooms on any given night, the owner, Henry Bellman, prided himself on maintaining a certain image of exclusivity. To Henry, this restaurant was more than a business, it was his entire identity. Henry Bellman, a man in his late 50s, had worked for decades to build his empire. His white hair was always neatly combed, his tailored suits always pressed and pristine. He carried himself with the cool confidence of someone who had spent years accumulating both wealth and power, but beneath that carefully curated exterior there was something much darker, an unspoken set of beliefs about who should be allowed into his establishment. Henry had never been overt about his biases, but those who knew him well understood what lay beneath his Polish demeanor. Over the years, he'd made countless judgments about who belonged at Lux Door and who didn't. Although Henry never said it outright, he had a particular disdain for people of certain backgrounds. Something only his closest employees ever noticed this evening. As Henry stood near the entrance, observing the guests as they arrived, a couple approached. They were dressed impeccably. The man wore a perfectly tailored black suit, and the woman was in a striking, elegant dress that shimmered under soft street lights. They walked with a kind of poise and grace that could turn heads. But as Henry glanced up at them, his initial smile faltered. The couple was black. Henry's subtle shift in demeanor was something only those who knew him well would have noticed. His smile became a little more forced, his voice a touch colder, but he greeted them as he would anyone else, all the while making silent judgments in his mind. To him, no matter how sophisticated they appeared, they didn't fit the image he wanted for his restaurant. "Good evening," Henry said with a practiced politeness. "Do you have a reservation tonight?" "Yes, we do," the man replied with a warm smile. "It's under the name Claire Montgomery." Henry glanced over at his maitre d', who quickly checked the reservation list before giving Henry a subtle nod. The couple had made a legitimate booking, but Henry couldn't help but wonder how they had slipped through the cracks in his meticulously controlled system. "Right this way," Henry said, leading them through the restaurant. As they walked through the dining area, Henry could feel the eyes of his usual clientele, mostly wealthy, older, and white. Following the couple, he caught the raised eyebrows, the exchanged glances, and the silent questions. To Henry, their presence was a disruption to the unspoken image of his restaurant. Instead of guiding them to one of the prime tables in the center of the room, Henry steered them to a small table in the corner near the kitchen doors. It was a subtle but deliberate choice, a way of signaling to the couple and the rest of the diners that they didn't quite belong. Ryan and his wife Claire exchanged a brief glance as they sat down. They had noticed the way Henry had looked at them, the way he had carefully avoided seating them in the center of the room. But they chose not to react after years of dealing with similar encounters. They had become experts at brushing off these subtle slights as Ryan pulled out Claire's chair. They both silently agreed not to let this ruin their night. They had come to celebrate their 12th anniversary, a milestone they had been looking forward to for months. They wanted this night to be special, no matter the circumstances. "Thank you," Claire said softly as she sat down. Henry gave them a tight smile before turning to leave, but as he walked away he couldn't shake the discomfort that had settled over him. It wasn't just that they were black, although that certainly played a part. It was the way they carried themselves, with confidence and ease, as though they had every right to be there. And in Henry's mind, that was a challenge to everything he believed. Back at the entrance, Henry discreetly pulled aside his maitre d'. "Keep an eye on them," he whispered. "Make sure everything's handled appropriately." The maitre d', who had long learned not to question Henry's motives, nodded and went about his duties. Over the next half hour, Henry kept a close eye on Ryan and Claire. From a distance, he watched the way they spoke quietly to each other, their laughter occasionally breaking the soft murmur of the dining room. He couldn't help but notice that they behaved impeccably, showing respect to the staff, following all the unspoken rules of fine dining. And yet he still found himself feeling uneasy about their presence. Meanwhile, Ryan and Claire were beginning to notice a pattern. The wait staff seemed hesitant to approach their table. The service was slow, almost as though their presence was an inconvenience. Their appetizers took longer than expected to arrive, and when they finally did, they were served with a half-hearted apology from a nervous waiter. Ryan glanced at Claire, and she returned his look with a knowing smile. They had been through this before in other places, other cities. They knew what was happening, but tonight they were determined not to let it get to them. This was their night, and no one, certainly not Henry Bellman, was going to ruin it. As the evening wore on, Henry's frustration grew. He had hoped that the couple's presence would provoke some kind of reaction, perhaps a complaint about the service, but they remained calm, unbothered by the subtle slights being thrown their way. Henry wasn't used to this. Most of his guests came to Luxor in awe of its exclusivity, humbled by the prestige of dining there. But Ryan and Claire didn't seem intimidated at all. In fact, they looked as though they belonged there. Just as much as any of the other diners, Henry's irritation simmered beneath the surface. As he continued to watch them, he felt the need to reassert his control over the situation, to remind them of the unspoken rules of his restaurant. Finally unable to contain himself any longer, Henry approached their table. Henry walked toward Ryan and Claire's table, trying to maintain the calm, composed facade he had perfected over the years. Inside, however, he was stewing with frustration. He had expected them to be uncomfortable by now, maybe even leave, but instead they were sitting there enjoying themselves as if they belonged at Luxor. It was a challenge to everything Henry believed in, his vision of what his restaurant represented. "Good evening, Henry," said, his voice smooth but cold as he reached their table. "I trust everything is to your liking so far." Ryan looked up at him with a polite smile. "Yes, everything's fine, thank you." Claire nodded in agreement, her voice calm and composed. "We're having a lovely evening." Henry felt a flash of annoyance at their calm demeanor. He had expected some sign of discomfort or irritation, but there was none. They weren't going to make this easy for him. "I'm glad to hear that," Henry said, forcing a smile. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain standard here at Luxor. I just wanted to make sure everything was up to your expectations." Ryan and Claire exchanged a brief glance, instantly recognizing the edge in Henry's words. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, the subtle suggestion that maybe this wasn't the kind of place where people like them typically dined. Ryan kept his tone steady as he responded, "Not taking the bait, we've heard a lot about this place, and we're happy we chose to come here for our anniversary." There was an undeniable reminder that this night meant something to them. Henry hesitated for a moment, realizing that he had miscalculated. He hadn't known it was their anniversary. For a brief second, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Maybe he should leave them alone, let them enjoy their night, but his pride wouldn't allow it. "That's wonderful," Henry said, his smile tightening, "although I must admit I was a bit surprised to see your reservation come through." "We don't often get." Henry paused for a fraction of a second, choosing his words carefully. "Guests who are new to our establishment. I hope it's lived up to your expectations so far." Ryan's expression remained calm, but Claire could sense the tension behind his eyes. She reached over and gently placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to remain composed. She knew what Henry was implying, but she didn't want to give him the satisfaction of getting a reaction. "Everything's been great," Ryan replied, his voice steady. "We appreciate the hospitality." Henry nodded, but something about their composed responses only irritated him further. They were supposed to feel out of place. They were supposed to be rattled by the exclusivity of the restaurant, the glances from the other diners. But instead they were handling it all with a grace that Henry hadn't anticipated. "Well," Henry said, straightening up slightly, "I'll leave you to your meal. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Claire said with a polite smile, her tone soft but firm. "We're looking forward to enjoying the rest of our evening." Henry turned and walked away, his thoughts racing as he returned to his post at the entrance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping out of his control. They weren't reacting the way he expected, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Back at the table, Ryan took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the frustration simmering just below the surface. But he wasn't going to let it ruin the night. He and Claire had come to celebrate something special, and he wasn't going to let Henry's thinly veiled hostility take that away from them. Claire gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her voice low but reassuring. "Don't let him get to you. We've dealt with worse." Ryan nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, you're right. I'm not going to let him spoil this." They had been through situations like this many times before, though not always in such a refined setting over the years. They had learned how to handle subtle acts of prejudice with grace, never allowing the small-mindedness of others to affect their sense of self-worth, but it still stung, especially on a night that was supposed to be about celebrating their love and the life they had built together. Meanwhile, Henry's mind was still turning over what had just happened. He knew he had crossed a line. Though he hadn't said anything overtly racist, the implications were there and they knew it. But Henry didn't care. His restaurant was his kingdom, and he had spent years building it into what it was. To him, maintaining its exclusivity wasn't just about money or prestige. It was about control, and tonight that control was slipping. As the evening wore on, Henry found himself glancing over at Ryan and Claire's table more often than he should have. They continued to act with dignity, never raising their voices or causing any kind of disturbance. In fact, to anyone else they would have appeared to be the perfect guest, but to Henry their mere presence was a disruption. At one point Henry's frustration boiled over. He called over his maitre d' once more, and whispered sharply, "Check their reservation again, make sure everything's in order." The maitre d' hesitated, sensing the underlying hostility in Henry's request. But he knew better than to question his boss. He quickly returned with confirmation that the reservation was indeed legitimate. Henry clenched his jaw, his irritation growing. He wanted any reason to confront the couple directly. But there was nothing. After another hour, Ryan and Claire's main course arrived. The waiter, clearly nervous, mumbled a quick apology for the delay. Ryan and Claire, still composed, thanked him and began eating. The food was excellent as expected. But the mood had already been tainted. They could feel the eyes on them, not just from Henry, but from some of the other diners as well. "They can keep staring," Ryan muttered under his breath. "But we're not leaving until we've had our dessert." Claire smiled, appreciating his attempted humor. That's the spirit. As they finished their meal, Henry couldn't take it anymore. He had spent the entire evening watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake, waiting for them to slip up and give him a reason to act, but they hadn't. They had behaved with more grace and dignity than most of his regular customers, and that more than anything infuriated him. Finally, Henry made a decision. He wasn't going to let them leave without reminding them of the unspoken rules of his establishment. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and strode purposefully across the dining room. Ryan and Claire looked up as he approached their table, their expressions polite but guarded. "Mr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery," Henry began, his tone smooth but with a hint of condescension. "I trust everything has been satisfactory this evening." Ryan nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you." "Good," Henry continued. "I just wanted to make sure, you see. We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain atmosphere here at Luxor. I couldn't help but notice that your reservation caused a bit of confusion." Claire raised an eyebrow, sensing where this was going. "Confusion?" Henry nodded, his smile never wavering. "Yes, well, we don't often receive reservations from guests who are new to our establishment. It's rare. But we strive to accommodate everyone to the best of our ability." Ryan exchanged a glance with Claire. They both knew what Henry was implying, but they weren't about to give him the satisfaction of reacting. "We made the reservation through the same process as anyone else," Ryan said evenly. "I'm sure it wasn't any different from any other reservation you receive." Henry's smile tightened. They weren't going to let him push them. He had hoped for a crack in their composure, some sign that they were uncomfortable, but instead they remained calm, collected, and dignified. "Well, I'm glad to hear that," Henry said, his tone colder now. "But I must say I was a bit surprised that you chose Luxor for such a special occasion. It's not the kind of place one typically finds your type of clientele." There was a thinly veiled insult hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its meaning. The insult hit like a quiet blow, but Ryan and Claire were prepared. They had seen this kind of thing before, just not so brazenly. For a moment there was silence at the table. Ryan sat back slightly, his expression calm but thoughtful. Claire, too, maintained her composure, though she clenched her napkin just a little tighter under the table. They weren't going to give Henry what he wanted. They wouldn't let him know how deeply his words cut. Ryan broke the silence first, his voice steady. "Our type of clientele." Henry hesitated for a split second. Doubt flickered in his mind, but he was too far in now, too committed to backing down. He couldn't let this couple walk away without asserting his authority, without making it clear that this wasn't their space. "Yes," Henry said, his voice smooth but now unmistakably condescending. "You see, we cater to a very specific demographic here. Our guests expect a certain atmosphere, a certain level of exclusivity. I'm not sure if you fully understand the nature of our establishment." Ryan's face was expressionless, but Claire saw the muscle in his jaw tighten slightly. She could tell he was working hard to keep his temper in check. Still, they both knew this wasn't the time or the place for a confrontation. "Not yet." Ryan leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and composed. He was greeted by a smartly dressed receptionist who escorted him to a conference room on the top floor. The room was spacious and luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the London skyline. A large table dominated the center of the room, flanked by comfortable leather chairs. Henry took his seat, feeling a sense of satisfaction. This was the kind of place where big deals were made, where men like him held the power. He didn't have to wait long. After a few minutes, the door opened, and in walked two impeccably dressed individuals, a man and a woman. Henry's heart skipped a beat when he recognized them. It was Ryan and Claire Montgomery. For a moment, Henry's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He had expected a wealthy investor, someone from his world, someone who fit his idea of what a high-powered deal-maker looked like. The last people he expected to see were the couple he had thrown out of his restaurant just a few days earlier. but that they were calm, composed, and exuding an air of quiet confidence. "That made Henry's stomach turn, Mr. Bellman," Ryan said, his voice smooth and professional as he extended his hand. "Thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Henry blinked, his usual composure slipping for just a moment. "Mr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery, I wasn't expecting," he trailed off. Unable to find the words, Claire stepped forward, her expression polite but firm. "Please have a seat, Mr. Bellman," she said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "We have much to discuss." Still reeling from the shock, Henry found himself moving mechanically. Taking his seat at the table, Ryan and Claire sat down across from him, their demeanor cool and collected, as though they had been in control of the situation. From the beginning, a team of lawyers and financial advisors entered the room. Carrying briefcases and thick folders, they took their places on either side of Ryan and Claire. Further emphasizing the couple's authority in this meeting, Henry sat in silence, his mind racing. As he tried to make sense of what was happening, finally Ryan broke the silence. Leaning forward slightly as he spoke, "Mr. Bellman, I'm sure you're wondering why we're here today." He began. "Allow me to explain." Henry said nothing, his mouth dry as he waited for the explanation. Ryan continued, his tone calm but deliberate. "My wife and I are entrepreneurs. We built a significant portfolio in the hospitality industry, including several high-end restaurants. When we came to Luxor the other night, it wasn't just to celebrate our anniversary. We were also evaluating your restaurant as a potential acquisition." The realization hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He had thought he was dealing with just another couple who didn't belong, but in reality they had been evaluating him. The shock of it left him momentarily speechless, his mind scrambling to keep up. "We've taken the time to review our options," Claire added, her voice measured, "and we decided that Luxor and your other establishments would make a valuable addition to our portfolio. That's why we're here today, to make you an offer." Henry blinked, trying to find his voice. "An offer?" Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes. We're prepared to purchase your entire restaurant chain for a price well above market value." Henry stared at them, still trying to process the situation. This couldn't be real. Why would they want to buy his restaurants after the way he had treated them, and more importantly, why were they offering more than the market value? There had to be a catch. Seeing the confusion on Henry's face, Ryan decided to clarify. "We're offering you a generous price because we believe in the potential of your establishments." Ryan explained, "However, there are conditions that must be met." "For the deal to go through, conditions?" Henry echoed, his voice tight. "Yes," Claire said, her gaze locking onto Henry's. "First, the sale must be completed quickly. We don't want this process to drag out over months. We have the resources to finalize the transaction in a matter of weeks. And we expect the same from you." Henry nodded slowly. That wasn't unusual. In high-stakes deals, speed was often a priority, but there was something about the tone in Claire's voice that made him uneasy. "What else?" Henry asked, his voice strained. "The second condition," Claire continued, her voice firm, "is that you step away from the business entirely. No public statements, no involvement in the transition. You will leave quietly, with no lingering attachment to the restaurants." Henry's jaw tightened. This condition was more troubling. He had built his restaurants from the ground up, poured years of his life into making them successful. The idea of walking away without any acknowledgement of his role felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. "And finally," Ryan added, his voice taking on a harder edge, "you will agree never to open a competing establishment. If you do, we will consider it a breach of contract and we will pursue legal action." At this, Henry's composure cracked, his face flushed with anger. This wasn't a business transaction. It was a hostile takeover. The conditions they were laying out felt like an attack, a deliberate attempt to strip him of his identity and his legacy. Henry tried to stay calm, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "Why these conditions?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. "Why do you want me out so completely?" Ryan and Claire exchanged a glance before Ryan spoke. "Let's just say we believe in doing business with integrity." "Mr. Bellman," Ryan said, his voice steady, "but point to the way you treated us the other night. Showed us exactly who you are, and we have no interest in being associated with that kind of attitude. We're offering you a way out, a very profitable way out, but it comes with the understanding that you will step aside completely." Henry felt a flash of indignation. How dare they judge him? They didn't know him. They didn't understand the pressures he was under, the image he had to maintain. But as he looked at Ryan and Claire, he realized there was no point in arguing. They held all the cards now, and they knew it. Still, Henry couldn't help but push back. "And if I refuse?" Henry asked, his voice low and tense. "What happens?" And Claire's expression didn't change, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. As she replied, "If you refuse, we'll walk away from this deal," she said, her voice firm. And we'll make sure everyone knows exactly why your investors your clients. The media, they'll all hear about how you treated us, and in today's world, that kind of story spreads fast. Henry's stomach churned. He knew she was right. A scandal like that could ruin him. Destroy everything he had built, his reputation, his business, his future. It would all be in jeopardy. The realization was bitter, but there was no escaping it. He was trapped, cornered by his own actions. The same couple he had dismissed as insignificant now had the power to take everything from him. For a long moment, Henry sat in silence, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could try to negotiate, but he knew it would be futile. Ryan and Claire had come prepared. And they weren't going to back down. They were offering him a way out, and as much as it pained him to admit it, Henry knew he had no choice but to take it, finally, with great reluctance. Henry nodded fine, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll agree to your terms. A small, satisfied smile played on Ryan's lips. Excellent. Our lawyers will finalize the paperwork, and we can move forward with the sale. Claire nodded in agreement, her expression softening slightly. You're making the right decision, Mr. Bellman. This will be good for everyone involved. Henry didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak, afraid that his anger and bitterness might spill over. Instead, he simply nodded again, signaling his acquiescence. The meeting continued with the lawyers going over the details of the contract, outlining the process of the sale. Henry listened in a daze, his mind still reeling from the shock of the situation. It felt surreal, as though you were watching someone else's life unfold, but it was real, too real. And there was no escaping it. By the time the meeting ended, the deal was all but sealed. The final papers would be signed within the week, and then it would be over. Henry would walk away with a substantial sum of money. But at the cost of everything, he had worked for everything that had defined him. As Ryan and Claire stood to leave, Ryan extended his hand to Henry. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Bellman. Ryan said, we'll ensure the transition is smooth. Henry shook his hand, the gesture stiff and formal. I'm sure you will, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Claire gave him a polite nod. Goodbye, Mr. Bellman. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. With that, they left the room, their legal team following close behind. Henry remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, resentment, regret, all churning inside him for the first time in his life. Henry Bellman felt truly powerless as the door closed behind Ryan and Claire. Henry remained seated, staring blankly at the polished wood of the conference table. His mind was racing, but it felt as though the rest of him was frozen in place. The enormity of what had just happened settled over him like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had built Luck's door from nothing, crafted it into a symbol of his success, his vision, his power. And now, with a few signatures on some documents, it would be gone, not just gone, but taken by the very people he had insulted and disrespected. The injustice of it all churned in his gut. He had always prided himself on maintaining control over his world, his business, his image, his clientele. And now, because of one miscalculation, it was all slipping away. The worst part wasn't the money. He would walk away with plenty of that. It was a humiliation. The knowledge that Ryan and Claire had outplayed him, turning what he had thought was a small inconvenience into his downfall. For the next few days, Henry went through the motions. The restaurant still needed to be run, papers needed to be signed, the transition needed to be managed. But everything felt hollow. He sat in his office staring at the framed articles and awards on the wall, reminders of a legacy that no longer belonged to him. Every phone call with his investors, every meeting with the staff felt like another nail in the coffin of the life he had built. But what gnawed at Henry the most was the realization that it wasn't just a single mistake that had brought him here. It wasn't just a night he had kicked Ryan and Claire out of the restaurant. No, this had been building for years. His arrogance, his belief that certain people didn't belong in his world, it had finally caught up with him. He had made a habit of pushing away anyone who didn't fit his narrow idea of who deserved to be in his space. And now those very same people had found a way to push back. It was a bitter irony that made him sick to his stomach. As the final day of ownership approached, Henry was summoned to the restaurant for the official signing. His legal team had already gone over the documents, ensuring that everything was in order. All that was left was to put pen to paper, to finalize the sale, and to walk away from Luck's door forever. When he arrived at the restaurant, it was bustling as usual. The soft clinking of glasses and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air. For a moment, Henry felt a pang of something, nostalgia perhaps, or regret. He had created this atmosphere, this experience. It had all been his vision, and now it would belong to someone else. Ryan and Claire were already seated in a private room at the back of the restaurant. When Henry arrived, their legal team was there too, and the air was thick with professionalism. They exchanged brief pleasantries, but there was no warmth in the interaction. It was strictly business now. Henry sat down the contract in front of him. He stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity. His signature would make it final. He would walk away with the money but lose everything else. He would lose the respect of his peers, the pride of ownership, and the sense of superiority that had defined his life. For so long his hand hovered over the paper, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Finally, with a shaky breath, he signed his name. It was done. Ryan extended his hand once more, the same polite smile on his face that he had worn the night they first met. "Thank you, Mr. Bellman. We'll take good care of the restaurant." Henry shook his hand. "Though it felt more like a formality than anything else, I'm sure you will," he said. Forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, Claire gave him a nod. "We're looking forward to continuing the legacy you built," she said, her voice measured but sincere. But Henry knew the truth. This wasn't his legacy anymore. It was as they would take Luxor and make it into something he never could have placed, where people of all backgrounds would be welcome, where exclusivity wouldn't be based on race or class, but on the quality of the experience. As Henry walked out of the room and through the restaurant for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost more than just a business. He had lost a piece of himself, something he would never be able to get back. Over the next few weeks, the sale of Luxor became the talk of the town. The local papers ran headlines about the transition, but the real story was one that spread through whispers and conversations at dinner parties and social gatherings. It didn't take long for the truth about that fateful night to come out. People began to talk about how Henry had treated Ryan and Claire, how he had tried to push them out simply because of the color of their skin. And as the story spread, so did the backlash. Henry's reputation, once impeccable, began to crumble. His former clients, who had once praised him for his refined taste and business acumen, started to distance themselves. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, and his old friends seemed to suddenly have less time for him. The elite circles he had once moved in with ease now felt cold and distant. Was still the other business ventures Henry had invested in began to suffer. Investors pulled out, wary of being associated with a man whose name was now tainted. The restaurants that he still owned struggled with fewer and fewer people willing to be seen at establishments linked to someone who had been publicly shamed for his bigotry. Henry tried to downplay the incident at first. He told anyone who would listen that the story had been blown out of proportion, that it had all been a misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. For Ryan and Claire, however, the transition was smooth and seamless. They took over Luxor and immediately began making changes. They updated the menu, refreshed the decor, and hired a more diverse staff. But the most important change was the atmosphere. The exclusivity that Henry had once prized was replaced with an air of inclusivity and warmth. The restaurant became known not just for its fine dining, but for the way it made every guest feel welcome and valued. Business boomed. The new Luxor attracted a broader clientele than ever before, with reservations booked weeks in advance. People from all walks of life came to experience the restaurant's renowned service and cuisine, and the place quickly became a symbol of positive change in the community. Meanwhile, Henry found himself increasingly isolated. The money from the sale had left him financially comfortable, but it did little to ease the bitterness that gnawed at him. He spent his days in his apartment, far from the world he had once commanded, nursing his regrets. The media moved on from the scandal, but Henry's sense of loss never faded. He had been a man of power, a man who believed that his wealth and influence made him untouchable, but now he understood the truth. It wasn't money or status that defined a person, it was how they treated others. And Henry had failed that test miserably. One evening, months after the sale, Henry made a decision. He would return to Luxor. Just once he rationalized it by telling himself he needed closure, that seeing the restaurant again might help him move on, but deep down he knew the truth. He wanted to see what they had done with his creation. Henry picked up the phone and called to make a reservation. The hostess on the other end was polite and professional, but when Henry gave his name, there was a brief pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bellman," she said, her tone courteous but firm. "We don't have any reservations available under that name." For a moment, Henry was speechless. He had fully expected to be recognized, to be accommodated. After all, this was his restaurant. But the hostess offered no recognition, no special treatment. He was just another customer now, indistinguishable from anyone else. Henry thanked her and hung up the phone. The weight of reality settling over him. The restaurant he had built, the life he had crafted, it was all gone. And there was no going back. Under Ryan and Claire's ownership, Luxor continued to thrive, becoming a beacon of inclusivity and excellence in the community. The restaurant flourished in ways Henry never could have imagined. Its success built not on exclusivity, but on the belief that everyone deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. And for Henry, the lesson was a harsh one. He had spent his life believing that wealth and power made him superior to others, that his position in society was unassailable. But in the end, it was his own arrogance and prejudice that brought him down. As the years passed, Henry remained a shadow of his former self. His name was forgotten, his influence faded, and the world moved on without him. The community he had once been a part of now saw him as a cautionary tale, a reminder that pride, arrogance, and bigotry will eventually catch up with you. And so, as Luxdor continued to flourish, Henry was left with nothing but his regrets. A man who had once believed he was untouchable, now rendered powerless by his own actions. In the end, the message was clear: prejudice and arrogance have a way of destroying. Even the most powerful and true success lies in treating everyone with dignity, respect, and kindness. Henry had learned that lesson too late, but for Ryan and Claire, it was a principle they had always lived by, and it was why they succeeded where Henry had failed.